Okay, guys, we're going to take a look at the powers of the president and how we elect the president, and I'm going to do this in a little reverse order. I want to talk about executive powers. How does the president actually execute the law and enforce the law? The executive power of the president is, in Article 2 of the Constitution, stated, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. Executive power means to execute, carry out. And that's what the president's job is, to solemnly swear that he will faithfully execute the office of the president and preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So who does that for them? Well, the president has a bureaucracy that supports him. It is a large, complex administrative structure that handles the everyday business of organization. In other words, the bureaucracy is all the employees and all the managers and all the workers, from the Department of Defense to the Treasury to the Department of Energy. It's the entire layer of workers who make up all the different organizations of the executive branch. Okay? So let's take a look at what bureaucracy sort of consists of. Okay? It is hierarchical, meaning there's a boss at top and there's somebody in the below him or her, and then down on the bottom is an entry-level position. There are rules. They carry out the day-to-day business of the government, and there are roughly 3 million people who are part of this bureaucracy. And a lot of times, you know, we make fun of it and criticize it because it's so big. Here we've got government growth, and it's getting huge, and there's a lot of job growth where the private sector is struggling. So what happens? How does it work? Well, federal bureaucrats make and shape policy. They administer decisions, they write rules and regulations, they write new laws for Congress to consider. Congress's major power over the bureaucracy is power of the purse. So, in other words, Congress controls the funding for something like the National Park Service. Congress controls the funding for the Department of Energy. Congress controls the funding for NASA. But inside those organizations, there are different rules that are made by the organizations for their members. So the National Park Service may start the workday for its maintenance staff at 6 in the morning or something like that. That would be a rule and regulation that they would set for themselves. And laws would be passed by Congress. So it wouldn't necessarily be a law that they would start at 7 in the morning. That would be an internal regulation. Lots of them, just all kinds of different organizations that exist in the bureaucracy. This is an amazing slide. This is the Secretary of Labor and the Labor Department and all the different organizations that exist under the Department of Labor. There's the Department of Veterans. There's the Bureau of Labor Affairs. There's Occupational Safety and Health, called OSHA. They do investigation of workplace safety and things. There is the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Administration and Management, Mine Safety, Labor Statistics, they calculate unemployment rate and such. The Pension Office, the Women's Bureau, Disability. These are all different agencies that exist under the Department of Labor, okay? So every one of these has a head or director and workers that work for it. These departments, like the Department of Labor, are called the Presidential Cabinet, okay? There are 15 different cabinet-level positions. Each unit is headed by a secretary chosen by the president and approved by the Senate, except the Department of Justice. The head of the Department of Justice is called the Attorney General. So here are the different people in Trump's cabinet. Secretary of Agriculture, okay? And Trump's cabinet, both cabinet and directors of key agencies. So when you see secretary, they're a cabinet-level position. Secretary of Commerce, Defense, Education, Energy, Housing and Urban Development, the Interior, Labor. Okay, then you have other people that serve with him and work at other agencies, such as the Director of Central Intelligence, Administrator of Small Business Association, Secretary of the U.S. Trade Representative. So there are multiple people that work with Trump and the president at high levels to implement policy under all these different particular agencies. So think about it. If your president is at the top, They have all these different agencies, and the secretary positions here are the head of these cabinet-level positions. They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. There are a whole bunch of other key individuals here, like, for example, we talked about the secretary or the director of central intelligence, administrator of the EPA. These are all other positions underneath these secretaries. It is a very large and complex system. To be in a cabinet, you need expertise. In other words, if you're going to be the Secretary of Defense, you should have some experience with the military. If you're going to be Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, you should have some experience in housing projects and administering construction and things like that. You need to be able to manage and have some leadership. You need to be acceptable to interest groups. Most presidents try to make their cabinet somewhat reflective of racial and gender representation. You want party loyalty. You generally nominate people who are in your party and loyal to your ideologies, because really, these people are implementing your policy. When you tell the Secretary of State to negotiate a treaty, he or she has to go do that. When you tell the Secretary of Defense that you have to work with the Defense Department to cut spending, he's to be on board with that. These are the ideas that you want implemented as a president, and these are the people that have to carry them out at the different levels. So you want different groups to implement the policy that give you both geographic balance, party loyalty, and to give you racial and gender representation. That is how the president fulfills his cabinet. Each cabinet manages a department. Collectively, they serve as an advisory board. So these are the people that advise the president. The president is not an expert on everything. President Trump may have good experience in business and in trade, but he might not know a lot about, and he might know housing and urban development. He might not know a lot about agriculture. He might not know a lot about atomic energy and energy production. So you rely on experts in those fields to help you. And Obama the same way. He had, he might know not about the law, but not a lot about defense, for example. So you have your cabinet level officials that are experts in these areas that help you implement policy. And how they help you implement policy is interesting. There's, like we said, the advisory and the help, but there's something called an executive order that Mr. Jeanette will talk about here a little bit down the road. All right, that's part one. Let's go back and finish part two, which is the Electoral College. We've talked a little bit about this in class, and the Electoral College is obviously something somewhat controversial, okay? Is it an outdated system, or is it a perfect fit for the presidential election? Here's how it works, okay? Each state is given someone called an elector. The elector is someone who does the actual vote in the Electoral College. So you take your number of senators, your number of representatives, and you have the number of electors per state. D.C. gets 3, okay, so that's 538. So you need to get more than half, so you need to get 270 to win. If a person wins all the popular vote in a state, they get all the electors. It's usually winner take all. There are a couple exceptions. Nebraska and Maine do it by congressional district. So in the upcoming election, it would be possible for Biden to win 1 electoral vote, say, in Nebraska, and I think there are 5, and Trump to get the other 4. So that's kind of strange. It's done by a congressional district. But most states, it's winner take all. Whoever wins the popular vote in Wisconsin gets all Wisconsin's electoral votes. Whoever wins the popular vote in California gets all of California's electoral votes. So, what do these people have in common? Andrew Jackson, Samuel Tilden, Grover Cleveland, Al Gore, and Hillary Clinton. Well, you know the answer, perhaps by now. And Jackson and Cleveland will be elected president, but at one point, everyone there won a presidential election in the popular vote, but did not become president because they did not win the Electoral College, okay? And, we've had some good battles here in recent years. The popular vote has been won a couple times in my lifetime, and now in your lifetime at least once, by someone who did not become president because of the Electoral College. Here was the popular vote in 2000. Al Gore just beats out George Bush, but Bush just beats out Gore in the Electoral College. That guy there with the glasses pulled up, he's looking at what's called a hanging chad. In Florida, there were a lot of ballots that were controversial. Were they voted for Bush? Did they vote for Gore? Can they be counted? They were actually like punch card ballots. These little cards that you would have to make an impression on, and they would have to pop out this little circle. I mean, it was like an old quiz back in the 1960s before this. Okay, here's the map of 2016. Quite an interesting map. You can see Clinton only got 232 electoral votes versus Trump's 306. But she did win the popular vote by a significant margin. So, did the election work? Well, I don't know. You know, look at the amount of states that Trump was victorious in. You know, if you were on one side, you'd argue, no, the election was a failure because Clinton got more people wanted Clinton to be president, and she wasn't president. Donald Trump became president. However, you could look at this map and say, well, look, the vast majority of the country and states and regions-wise, right, area-wise, wanted Trump to be president. So this actually worked out because it helps get the, you know, the will of the republic, as it were, regionally and geographically represented better than just the large population areas on the coast. So here's my question for you. If you were running for president with only a few states, right, and limited money, where would you focus your campaign? Use your map to decide what states you want to win. And this is kind of cool. If you look back here, so here this is Gore in the 2000 race with Bush, okay? You can see a Democratic vote up here in Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, and then Pennsylvania and Ohio. Okay, Ohio splitting for Bush, Pennsylvania splitting for Gore. So when you're Donald Trump and you look at this map, you know, where do you want to win? Florida was a key controversial state, but, you know, the coasts are kind of locked up, except for New Hampshire here. This is the Midwest, the upper Midwest and Great Lakes is really where you want to dominate. From Pennsylvania to Minnesota really is deciding the elections in the past few cycles. And if you look at 2016, that's where Trump won. By getting Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and Iowa, those are key states that swung the election in Trump's favor, and garnering Florida again, too. So, again, Mike Pence from Indiana, that was his strategy, was to win these states on a campaign that dealt with the job losses due to free trade and try to implement some policies that would help people here through tariffs and such like that, okay? All right, so here are the electoral votes. Here's what each state offers up. Pretty simple. Every state has 2 senators. Just take 2 away from the number, and you have the number of representatives there. Clearly, the largest state in terms of population is California. Then we go to Texas and New York. Florida are the key states that you want to win to, you know, to get large electors. California, New York, pretty liberal. Texas, pretty conservative, although it's leaned a little more moderate, perhaps, in this upcoming race, and perhaps Texas is changing a little bit. But Ohio, Pennsylvania, the upper Midwest, key states to any election. So, what are some drawbacks to the Electoral College? Well, in some ways, it encourages low voter turnout. If you think about it, geez, if I live in California and Biden is up 35% in California, why do I vote for Trump? Why do I bother? Yeah, you've got congressional elections and local elections, and you should turn out. But if your main reason for turning out is to vote for the president, and you're a Biden fan in Idaho or Wyoming, you know, it doesn't seem like you can do very much. Maybe that's, you know, kind of a neat thing about Nebraska and Maine. By splitting it by congressional districts, maybe it's a little more competitive. It's hard to be a third party if your vote is based on the Electoral College and you run as a third party. It's nearly impossible for you to get the 270 to win. Person with most popular votes may not win. Yeah, this is true to a certain extent. there are some states that do have fines if you vote for someone else other than the person that you've pledged to vote for. So if I'm a Republican and I'm in Wisconsin, I'm a member of the Republican Party, let's say,